Victims of violent crime often experience attacks in similar ways, with paralysis, physical and psychological, and even dissociative states. It can make it very hard to recount their story in the kind of linear and reasoned fashion that the criminal justice system demands. Dr. Laurie Haskell is a clinical psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and she joins us now for more. Nice to have you here.
Thank you, Steve.
Let's start with that. What are the common characteristics that people who have been the victim of violent crimes generally exhibit?
So post-assault, most people would have oftentimes a psychological numbness. So they have a shutdown. They have difficulty forming a narrative about their experience. It's in fragments for them. And but you can have the opposite as well. People who are very hyper-aroused, so they're jumpy, they're irritable. So the brain has stress hormones that have flooded their brain and their body. So depending on what stress hormones are and what levels for that person. So you can see people who can't calm themselves down versus people who may be completely dissociative or people who are quite numb. So there's quite a range of experiences.
Yeah. Makes it somewhat difficult, I presume, to either treat or investigate because people react different ways.
Yes, people expect the hyper-aroused response. I think people are confused by the shutdown dissociative response.
How about in the midst of the act of violence taking place? Again, is it a variety of reactions?
Initially, a lot of people, as soon as the fear circuitry is triggered in the brain, and this part of neuroscience is the most studied, they often will go into, immediate freeze. And the brainstem is inhibited, and they're just watchful, thinking, how do I escape? And then more hormones are flooded through their brain and their body, and they can go through a whole range of experiences, from being completely dissociative to having vivid moments. A lot of people talk about the moments that are what we call superencoded, where the adrenaline has heightened what that memory is, and they can recall in detail certain things. And then other details can't be recalled at all. Because the brain actually, if I pulled a gun on you right now, and I certainly wouldn't.
Please don't.
Exactly. I thought
I should have checked to see if
exactly.
you
if
were
I had a weapon
before. Yes, exactly.
But your brain would focus on my weapon, and your whole perceptual field would narrow, and you wouldn't be encoding any other information. You would be encoding just the central details.
So other stuff could be going on in here, and I wouldn't know anything about it.
Yeah, exactly. And most people are asked questions about what was going on around you.
And that explains why they don't know.
Exactly.
In which case, why, particularly in settings around the justice system, courts, interviews with the Crown, with police, and so on, why do we apparently expect people who have been through this kind of trauma to behave completely rationally and respond, in the way that one would require in a court?
I think it's because a lot of people haven't understood the neurobiology of these experiences. So what happens when the brain's flooded? Part of the brain becomes deactivated, including the prefrontal cortex, which is our rational, executive thinking part of the brain, because that's not necessary for survival. Survival, you want to go into a more primitive state of just focusing on the central details, trying to get through it. So after a car accident, we don't expect someone to be able to tell a story, right? So there's a sense that I think there's an assumption that it's not terrifying. Maybe there's an assumption still that a sexual assault isn't something that creates a lot of fear or threat for someone. And then minimizing those responses. Because generally, when I have lots of sexual assault victims that come to my private practice, most of them cannot tell me the story. It takes a long time to create that narrative. They don't have that, and they certainly, during the middle of the assault, they're not strategizing or thinking through. So I was an expert in the court in one case where a woman was quite terrified of a man who'd been sexually assaulting her, and he was locked out one night. He was quite drunk, and he was pounding on the door, saying, "Let me in." And she stood on the other side of the door, and then she opened it. And so during court, the defense is saying, well, if you were so afraid of him, why did you open him? And she said, I don't know. And that's a pretty typical response. It wasn't she was in irrational thinking of, and they said, why don't you just go to the phone and call 911? That wasn't available to her. She just thought, if I don't, I'm going to be in worse danger. And part of her brain would have been disconnected, and she wasn't thinking. Unfortunately, no one says, what were you feeling? What were you thinking? And when I'm an expert in court, they just give me a transcript that says, what did you do next? What did you do next? But if someone said, while you were standing outside that door, do you remember what you were feeling in your body? Do you remember what thoughts were going through your head? Then you have really important evidence. She might say, I felt frozen, or I don't remember feeling anything, that's evidence. That means someone's dissociative or, shut down. Or if she said, all I could think of, do what you need to do to survive. Again, that's really important information. But those things get missed.
What do you think it says about the justice system that for some reason, if the trauma of a car accident on the one hand and the trauma of an attempted rape on the other hand, we seem to have lots of understanding for why the mind might shut down and not realize various facts for the car accident, but somehow the justice system doesn't seem to appreciate the same could be true in an attempted rape.
Exactly. And I don't want to generalize too much, but I still think there's an attitude that rape is just sex. Not that rape is in a horrifying, threatening experience for people who are victims of it. And especially if it's relational. So if it's your boyfriend or your date, there's a minimization that when that person started to hold you down too firmly or ignore what you wanted, that your brain didn't go into threat mode and the fear circuitry wasn't activated.
Can I understand that better? Do we have any idea what percentage of attempted rapes are done by people that the victim knows?
Probably the majority, like 90%.
Probably the majority,
Exactly.
90%.
Yeah. So stranger rapes are very rare.
In which case, the fact that you probably do know your assailant, no doubt complicates the whole process, eh?
Exactly.
How so? Tell me more about that.
Part of it is, and we saw from, the Ghomeshi case, there was a lot of focus on, post-victim assault behavior. So I think, you have people who've been confused, overwhelmed in the moment, right, because of the neurobiological responses. But then there's a confusion, and my clients will say this, and most of my clients who were sexually assaulted contacted their offender afterwards. Because did this really happen? Maybe he'll make a repair, maybe he didn't intend to do this. I really care about him still. That maybe I can overcome this. So there's this confusion of, did this person really violate my body? Maybe they didn't intend to. So, and I think those, for later on when someone's thinking, well, if this was an event that happened, you would have a really clear response about it. But it isn't, it's confusing when it's someone you care about.
Can you explain why, in terms of recovering from the assault, some people seem to get over it much more easily than others who have a much more difficult time with it? Why is that?
That's a complicated question. So women who, and we know that the majority of cases are women who've already been abused in childhood. So if you've already been sexually assaulted in childhood or were harmed at the level of dissociation, and then you have a later adult experience, you have a much more protracted time trying to recover. And
because of that history?
Because of that history. Because the responses are more extreme, the dissociation happens faster, and it disrupts their sense of, am I ever going to be safe in this world? Right? So they have a lot of increased fear, terror, depression, and as well, how people responded to afterwards and the kind of support, where they believed, where they validated, helps some people recover much faster.
In which case, let's talk about how we might change things going forward that would improve matters.
Okay.
For example, if a woman has been raped and she goes to the police and she wants to, report the details of what happened or try and get some assistance or whatever, what should the police do in future as compared to the way they're doing things now, which would be better?
One of the big things that they're doing in the States, they have big campaigns called Start by Believing. You still go and gather your evidence. So if I went to a break-in at your house, I wouldn't go to your door thinking he's probably lying about this. So I'm going to keep testing his story. I'm going to sit there with a really cold face, like I'm not going to give anything. I'm not going to be, compassionate or caring, because this might all be a lie. That doesn't happen. With a sexual assault, the attitude is the person might be lying. And so they're not comforted.
Is that across police forces,
Not
male
police
or
force.
female officer?
That's, it's still a huge, even, last year I was training detectives in Vancouver, and a police detective put up her hand and she says, I asked victims to tell me the story, the narrative backwards. And I said, why? And she said, to see if they're lying. So they start, not all, but many start thinking they're lying to me.
It's a presumption of lying.
And if you try to question someone and you're assuming that they're lying, that demeanor is communicated in many ways, or you're testing the narrative. And so I think they have to start by being much more compassionate, and also by starting consistent with the architecture of the memory, which is, what is it that you remember from your experience? Not tell me the story, because it usually isn't encoded as a cohesive coherent narrative. So what is it that stood out for you? And so, one woman, there's a story from the States where she said, all I did was lay there and look at the ceiling tile and count the holes in the tile.
Because that's how she got through it.
That's how she got through it. The prosecutor got a picture of that ceiling tile. He had asked her how many holes. She said 36. There was 36 holes. That became an important piece of evidence. So what happens is they ask for the story. They don't ask what they were feeling. They don't start where the victim needs to start, and they start by questioning them in a suspicious way. And that activates, again, the person's brain to feel, I'm under threat, and then they can't recall the details.
And again, what is it about this crime as compared to, let's use your example of a home invasion?
Right.
Why a presumption of disbelief instead of belief in this case?
And these stereotypes have just lived on for so long that, women lie, women just have sex that they regret, that this isn't really true. These statistics, it can't be really that prevalent. So there's a lot of rape myths that have lived on. And I think that lots of times, the way the system is set up, because women drop out or they go to the police and it's unfounded because they haven't been interviewed in the way that's effective, or they say we don't have enough evidence. People think women are lying because of the unfounded. And oftentimes when they get to court, there's lots of inconsistencies in their statements. And that's again because they were asked the questions about those peripheral details, or they were interviewed too soon after the event. The rule is people shouldn't be interviewed after a traumatic event until they've had 2 nights sleep. So their brain has time to consolidate it, and the stress hormones have left their brain.
Let's follow up in the court since you've taken us there. Okay, we talked about how the police ought to do things differently. How about judges? How should judges handle cases of sexual assault and/or rape when they come into their courtrooms?
Again, I think by making courtrooms that are more receptive. I was just in Prince George last week, and they have a whole team of therapy dogs that sit with victims in the courtroom.
It's in British Columbia.
Yeah. So the dogs are right there in the courtroom, sitting with the victim who's on the stand. So giving them ways to comfort them, but also judges need to be much more assertive in not allowing unethical defenses. And the law professor, David Tanovich, wrote a paper last year saying stop whacking victims, talking about the brutal ways that they are questioned and actually bullied on the stand.
So a judge would intervene more often?
And intervene more often. Don't allow these kinds of defenses to happen. And I think, if everyone understands, if you actually put someone under threat and fear while they're trying to testify, they can't recall the details. They can't really tell the story. It's not really getting at the truth. I don't know why we think that's an effective method.
I can't have you in that chair and not ask you about the most high-profile case involving a judge and rape in this country in I don't know how many years. It happened, of course, in the province of Alberta. I understand you've done some consulting on that case, or you're peripherally involved with it somehow. Right. So we're talking, of course, about Robin Camp, the judge who asked the witness, the woman who had been raped, on the stand, why didn't you just keep your knees closed?
Right.
Can you tell us what you learned from that experience?
I can't talk about that experience because I was a witness in those proceedings, and it's still a case that hasn't been come to terms yet.
Yes.
It's not being resolved. But in terms of my other work in the criminal justice system and with judges, what I've learned is, first of all, a lot of judges, and again, not all judges, I never want this to sound like I'm saying all this about all police or judges or crowns, but a lot of judges are promoted to the level of judge, and they've never even sat in a trial. They haven't practiced criminal law. They've never really learned any in-depth information around sexual assault. And the paradigm shift that I'm suggesting is a pretty significant shift. And I think it needs much more in-depth training and understanding to respond differently to victims.
How do you get to be a judge if you've never been to a trial?
And there are judges, if you go to the Ministry of Justice website and look at the profiles of judges who are being promoted, you could be an entertainment lawyer, you could do civil litigation, you could do corporate law, and then you become a judge and you've never been in a trial, and suddenly you're a judge sitting in a courtroom. So I think it's how do we promote our judges, and how do we make sure that they have the kind of in-depth knowledge of sexual assault and understand the psychological repercussions as well as the gender issues. There was a case, again, in Alberta, it wasn't Justice Camp, another judge.
She hastens to add, okay.
Who didn't believe a young woman who actually had threw a water bottle in the hallway at someone who's being intrusive with her, but she had laughed. And he said the laugh was inconsistent with someone who didn't want this event, this kind of sexual attention. there's just something in the New York Times yesterday about laughter is one way of trying to disarm someone who's making you uncomfortable. So a lot of these normal ways that women are socialized to try to accommodate, deflect, disarm someone who's making them uncomfortable are used against them.
Can I understand this better, though? You could be an entertainment lawyer for 25 years, representing clients in show business, and then find yourself presiding over a rape trial, and you've had no training in the courtroom dynamics of that situation?
You're supposed to read a bench book and get information, but that's very different. I mean, I have crowns that I've worked with who've been in the field for 17, 20 years. They say this is the most complex work, and they learn all the time because it takes even the effects that I'm describing are really hard to understand in terms of the person's personal psychology, if they had a childhood of dissociation, the neurobiology. There's all these things that are shaping the responses, and what's good evidence, and how do you get access to that good evidence, and how do we treat people?
I want to, in our remaining moments here, I want to come at it from the other side,
Okay.
which is, I don't have to tell you, one of the cornerstones of our criminal justice system is the presumption of innocence, and yet you have suggested that one of the things police and judges need to do is start by believing the victim.
Yes.
And that is, I don't have to tell you, 180 degrees from what our justice system is supposed to be about, which is presume the so-called perpetrator is innocent.
Right.
How do we get around that?
So even though you're assuming he's innocent, that means doesn't mean then she's guilty or she's lying. So one doesn't mean the other. And that's what we've been doing. He's innocent, she must be, let's really look at her credibility, the way she's telling the story. Yes, get evidence, get the information, but also look at different types of evidence. If someone is dissociative there's a case I'm reading right now where a woman has a sensory fragment. She said,
Sorry, what's that?
Well, a sensory fragment, people remember, like, I can't get that smell, the smell of the alcohol on his breath. Okay. That's their starting point. Or that moment when I felt him squeeze my throat, or when he pushed me down on the bed. So that's what's predominant in their brain. And so they'll say, that's all I'm remembering right now. And people say, well, but if you start with that and you help them fill up the pieces, then they slowly recall really important pieces, like the one with the ceiling tile. Going back, well, there's some corroborative evidence. But I think it doesn't mean go and not get the evidence. It just means the attitude you have with the person, you're not assuming they're lying.
Because I know you're not a big Twitter person, but there is a hashtag on Twitter right now, hashtag believe her. And I guess some people are going to want to know whether or not believing her, first and foremost, means we're doing away with the presumption of innocence. Do you think? No,
because we believe he's innocent, we're believing she's innocent. We're believing her. We're believing something has happened.
Okay, but both can't be true, right?
Well, then the evidence will tell the story. That's why we investigate. That's why we get the information.
We are going to have a discussion right after you and I are done here with a larger group of guests who say that because of the nature of the crime of sexual assault and the prevalence of it in our society, which I think we're learning a lot more about thanks to the grossness of the American election campaign right now and some of the information that is coming to the fore, that maybe we should have a separate court system that deals with victims of sexual violence as opposed to other kinds of violence. What do you think of that notion?
I know the domestic violence courts have been profoundly effective. So I think the idea of having people who have this expertise, have specialized knowledge, have all kinds of courtrooms that are set up to meet the requirements of making a person feel safer and more welcomed, and just the trust that this courtroom is people who understand these dynamics. I think it probably could go a long way, and we won't have some of the mistakes we're seeing, judicial mistakes we're seeing now of judges, because I don't think anyone does this work with any intention of harming people. I think the idea of not understanding certain pieces of people's behavior, or not understanding the kind of evidence, or not understanding the demeanor of someone who's been traumatized has led to profound errors. And I think women don't go forward anymore. We know very few women report these crimes. We know fewer women.
Why would you, given what you know what's waiting for you?
Exactly. Unfounded levels are high even at the point when they do go to the police, and then there's very few convictions. So I did focus groups last year at U of T, I think almost 40 of them with students, and around sexual assault. I'd say maybe one or two said they would even go to the police.
One or two women said, if it happened to me, I wouldn't do it. Yes, that's it.
Out of, So there, that's discouraging. I mean, not that we want massively, incarcerated offenders, But if a woman does want safety and she's feeling that this person is dangerous.
And she feels there's no justice on the other end for her.
Exactly, right? And how do we have a deterrent? How do we have women think, I want to be able to carry on in this world and not have to be under threat all the time?
We are going to carry on the conversation with our next group of guests, but I want to thank you, Dr. Lori Haskell,
Yes.
clinical psychologist, U of T, for getting us started. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.